Shaq placed his bag in the overhead compartment, ready to settle in for a quiet flight, until he heard it. "Excuse me, you're in the wrong seat." He turned. A wealthy woman eyed him with disgust, her lips curling. "This is first class. You should be back there." She gestured toward economy. The cabin fell silent. Passengers glanced over. The flight attendant hesitated. Cameras started recording. Shaq could have argued. He could have called her out. But instead he just smiled. Because he had a plan. One that would leave the entire plane speechless. "All right? Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The soft hum of passengers settling in filled the first-class cabin. Shaquille O'Neal adjusted his seatbelt, stretching his long legs in the extra space he had paid for. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air as a flight attendant moved through the aisle, helping passengers stow their bags. Just as Shaq leaned back into his seat, ready for a peaceful flight, a sharp voice sliced through the calm. "You're in the wrong seat." Shaq blinked, turning his head slightly. A woman stood over him, arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her designer purse. She was in her late 50s, with short blonde hair styled into an immaculate bob, pearl earrings glinting under the cabin lights. Dressed in an expensive beige pantsuit, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had always gotten her way. Shaq gave her a polite nod. "No, ma'am. This is my seat." The woman scoffed, glancing at his casual attire. A black hoodie, basketball shorts, and fresh sneakers. "I don't think so," she said with an exaggerated chuckle, shaking her head. "This is first class. You must be in economy." A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at their phones. Others looked toward the flight attendants, sensing tension in the air. Shaq stayed calm, his expression unreadable. This wasn't the first time someone had assumed things about him based on appearance alone. The woman turned to a flight attendant who had approached upon hearing the exchange. "Miss, could you please check his ticket?" she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I think he may be confused." The young flight attendant hesitated, glancing at Shaq apologetically before speaking. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Shaq nodded, reaching into his pocket and handing it over. The attendant scanned it and then smiled. "You're in the right seat, Mr. O'Neal. Everything checks out." The woman's expression twisted, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for another excuse. "That can't be right," she finally muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. Shaq, still relaxed, raised an eyebrow. "Would you like me to move to the cockpit instead? Maybe fly the plane while I'm at it?" A chuckle rippled through the cabin, breaking the tension for a moment. But the woman wasn't laughing. Her face burned red, humiliated yet unwilling to back down. She squared her shoulders, turning her icy gaze back to the flight attendant. "Well, I don't want to sit next to him," she said firmly. "Move him." The flight attendant's eyes widened, stunned. A hush fell over the cabin. All eyes were now on them. The woman's voice cut through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin like a knife. "I paid for first class. I shouldn't have to sit here." Passengers turned, their heads swiveling like spectators at a tennis match. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others openly gawked at the scene unfolding before them. The energy in the cabin shifted. Conversations died down, and all eyes landed on the woman and Shaq. Shaq adjusted himself in his seat, keeping his expression calm, though his fingers curled slightly against the armrest. He had dealt with people like this before. He had heard the same coded language, the same misplaced entitlement disguised as policy. This wasn't about a seat. It was about something much deeper. The flight attendant, a petite woman with short brown hair and a name tag that read Melissa, stepped forward, holding her tablet in both hands. She took a slow, measured breath before speaking. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but I've already confirmed Mr. O'Neal is in the correct seat. There's nothing to discuss." "There is something to discuss," the woman snapped, her eyes narrowing. "This section is for people like us." Shaq didn't miss the way her lip curled slightly as she said it. He also didn't miss the approving nod from the businessman sitting next to her, a silver-haired man in a crisp navy suit. He leaned in and murmured something to her, but it was loud enough for others to hear. "She's right," he muttered, shaking his head. "First class is meant to be an exclusive experience." Shaq exhaled slowly. He could already see where this was going. It didn't matter that he was a multimillionaire. It didn't matter that he had likely flown first class more times than this woman had stepped foot on a plane. None of that mattered. To people like her, he didn't belong here. The murmurs grew louder. A younger couple sitting across the aisle frowned in disapproval. A woman in a business suit shook her head in disbelief, but no one said anything. No one wanted to get involved. The businessman beside the woman cleared his throat and turned to the flight attendant. "I don't mean to cause trouble," he said, his tone laced with fake politeness. "But surely you understand why some of us are concerned about maintaining the standards of first class." Melissa's eyes flashed with something Shaq couldn't quite place. She set her jaw and took a small step forward. "Sir, first class is for paying customers," she said, her voice firm. "And Mr. O'Neill has a valid ticket, just like you." The woman let out a sharp laugh. "I highly doubt that." A ripple of discomfort swept through the other passengers. Some shifted in their seats, glancing at Shaq with sympathy, while others looked away, suddenly very interested in their in-flight magazines. The businessman smirked, shaking his head. "Maybe he got lucky with an upgrade," he said. "Airlines do give those out sometimes." Shaq finally turned to face them fully, his voice calm but steady. "I paid for first class," he said, his deep voice carrying just enough weight to silence the murmurs. "Just like you." The woman leaned back, crossing her arms over her designer blouse. A slow, smug smirk crept across her face. "Then prove it." The air inside the cabin felt thick, heavy with the weight of the moment. Shaq's jaw tightened. He reached for his boarding pass, ready to put an end to this nonsense. But before he could even pull it out of his pocket, the woman snatched Shaq's ticket right out of his hand. The entire plane gasped. Shaq reached into his pocket, calm but firm, ready to put an end to this ridiculous scene. But before his fingers could even graze the ticket, the woman lunged forward. With a swift, entitled motion, she snatched the boarding pass straight out of his hand. Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. Time seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped. Flight attendants turned. Even passengers from economy craned their necks, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Shaq blinked, stunned for a half-second. He had encountered ignorance before. Subtle digs, hushed whispers, the kind of discrimination that lurked beneath fake smiles. But this was different. The woman held the ticket up like it was evidence in a courtroom. "See?" she said, shaking it for dramatic effect. "It has to be fake." She turned to the flight attendant, smug as ever, her manicured fingers still gripping the ticket. "Check it again. I bet it's a mistake." A few rows back, a businessman in a tailored suit shook his head, muttering, "This is going too far." Melissa, the flight attendant, visibly stiffened. She reached out, her expression tight with barely concealed anger. "Ma'am, return his ticket now." The woman scoffed but didn't move. Instead, she laughed. It was an ugly sound, sharp, condescending, like she thought she had already won. "Oh, please, you can't seriously believe he's supposed to be here?" She turned, gesturing wildly toward Shaq. "Just look at him. Look at me. We're not in the same category." The word hung in the air, unsaid but understood by everyone. Another wave of uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the passengers. A younger woman in a blazer looked disgusted. A man in the row ahead turned to his wife, shaking his head, but no one spoke up. Shaq exhaled slowly. His patience was long, but it wasn't infinite. He unfolded his arms and leaned slightly forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the woman. His voice, deep and measured, cut through the tension. "Give me my ticket." For the first time, something flickered across the woman's face. Hesitation. Melissa, the flight attendant, didn't wait. She snatched the ticket back from the woman's hands, checking it once more, then nodded and handed it to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill is exactly where he belongs." Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the woman's arrogance like a blade. Shaq took his ticket back without another word, sliding it back into his pocket. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. But he wasn't going to give them anger. He wasn't going to give her that power. The woman, however, still wasn't done. She crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. "This is unbelievable," she muttered. "I'm not sitting next to him. I want to be moved." Melissa took a deep breath, then reached for the intercom. Her voice rang out over the speakers, steady, professional, but with an unmistakable edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we take off, I'd like to remind everyone of our airline's policy. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Passengers are expected to treat each other with respect. And those who refuse? She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. May be asked to leave. A few passengers clapped. The woman's face twisted. Her smugness was gone. She looked around for support, but even the businessman beside her had sunk lower in his seat, distancing himself from the mess she created. Her cheeks flushed red. She whipped her head toward Melissa, eyes blazing. You can't do that. The flight attendant smiled. Actually, I can. The entire plane was silent. Every single passenger sat frozen, eyes darting between Shaq, the woman, and the flight attendant. The tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting, like a storm waiting to break. And then, over the intercom, the flight attendant's voice rang out. Ladies and gentlemen, before we take off, I'd like to make an important announcement. The woman smirked, leaning back in her seat as if she had already won. Even her companion, the businessman who had backed her up earlier, had the audacity to look pleased with himself. Shaq, however, remained calm, his massive frame still relaxed in his seat. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Melissa, the flight attendant, took a step forward, scanning the first-class cabin with an authoritative gaze. At this airline, we expect all passengers to follow proper conduct. That means treating fellow travelers with respect. She let her words linger, giving every passenger a chance to absorb them. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded in agreement. The woman rolled her eyes. Oh, please, spare me the speech. Melissa turned to her, expression neutral but firm. Passengers who refuse to sit next to another customer for reasons that violate our airline's anti-discrimination policy. She paused for effect. Will be removed from the flight. The smugness evaporated from the woman's face. Her jaw dropped. Her fingers clenched around the armrest. You can't do that. Melissa offered her a tight smile. Actually, I can. A ripple of approval swept through the first-class cabin. Someone let out a low whistle. The businessman beside the woman suddenly became very interested in his in-flight magazine, pretending he wasn't associated with her. The woman sputtered, looking around desperately for backup. But no one came to her defense. Shaq didn't say a word. He simply watched, arms crossed, as the woman's entire world crumbled around her. Melissa wasn't done. She raised an eyebrow. Would you like to stay in your assigned seat, or shall I have security escort you off the plane? The woman's face flushed red. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead. She had two choices: accept the humiliation and sit quietly for the rest of the flight, or throw another tantrum and risk being dragged off like an entitled fool. For a moment it looked like she was going to fight it. Her mouth opened. Her breath came in short, angry bursts, and her hand curled into a fist. Then something shifted. Maybe it was the murmurs around her. Maybe it was the realization that every single person in first class now despised her. Or maybe it was the fact that Shaq, the man she had so desperately tried to remove, hadn't even needed to lift a finger to put her in her place. She had done it all by herself, her lips pressed together into a tight, angry line. Then, with a huff, she turned away, staring out the window like a spoiled child. Melissa nodded, satisfied. That's what I thought. A slow clap started from the back of the first-class section, then another, and another. Within seconds, half the cabin was applauding. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head with an amused smile. The woman didn't turn. Her entire body was rigid with humiliation. Melissa leaned toward Shaq, her voice just loud enough for the woman to hear. Enjoy your flight, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq chuckled. I think I will. Just as everyone settled back into their seats, the flight attendant's earpiece crackled. A message from the cockpit. Then Melissa turned back to the woman. Actually, the pilot would like a word with you. Shaq sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The entire situation was ridiculous. He could have ended it right then and there. Let the flight attendant handle it. Let the woman stew in her own embarrassment. But where was the fun in that? Slowly, deliberately, Shaq stood up. A ripple of movement spread through the cabin. Heads turned. People whispered. The woman's smug expression flickered, barely concealing the fact that she thought she had won. Even the flight attendant hesitated, unsure of what Shaq was about to do. The woman crossed her arms, tilting her chin upward. Good, she muttered. Finally. But Shaq wasn't leaving. Instead, he turned to her, towering over her seat. His deep voice was calm, but carried a weight that made the entire cabin hold its breath. "If you want to move, be my guest." The woman's smirk vanished. The businessman sitting beside her coughed awkwardly, suddenly pretending to be very interested in his in-flight magazine. She blinked. Shaq gestured toward the back of the first-class section. "You don't want to sit next to me? Fine, there's an empty seat right over there." Her head snapped toward the seat in question. It was near the bathrooms, a cramped little spot at the back of first class, directly across from the door where people would be constantly walking in and out. Her face paled. If she moved, she'd look ridiculous. She would be the woman who made a huge scene only to end up in the worst seat possible. But if she stayed, she would have to sit next to Shaq. The entire cabin was watching now, waiting for her decision. Shaq arched an eyebrow. What's it gonna be? For the first time, the woman had no words. The businessman beside her swallowed, then whispered, "Maybe you should just—" "Shut up!" she snapped. Passengers around them started snickering. One man a few rows ahead muttered, "She really set herself up for that one." The woman's nails dug into her armrests. She was trapped. The flight attendant cleared her throat, hands clasped in front of her. "It's up to you, ma'am." Seconds ticked by. Shaq could see the war raging inside her. Her pride was screaming at her to move. But her reputation, already hanging by a thread, was telling her to stay put. The entire plane was waiting. Finally, she sucked in a sharp breath, her lips pressing into a thin line. She stayed. Without a word, she turned forward, arms crossed so tightly they looked like they might snap. Shaq smirked. Checkmate. A murmur of approval swept through the cabin. A few passengers shook their heads. Others chuckled under their breath. The businessman beside her let out a relieved breath, shoulders sagging. Shaq sat back down, stretching his legs. He didn't even look at her. Didn't need to. He had already won. Just as things settled, the flight attendant's earpiece crackled. A message from the cockpit. Then she turned back to the woman. "Actually, the pilot would like a word with you." Shaq sat still, his hands resting on his lap as he watched the woman clutch her purse like it was the last thing grounding her. Her chest rose and fell sharply, her face a shade of red that had nothing to do with the temperature inside the plane. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted completely. No longer was she in control of the situation. No longer did she have the upper hand. "Fine," she said through clenched teeth, the word barely more than a whisper. She reached down stiffly, grabbing her carry-on bag and looping the strap over her shoulder. The tension in her posture betrayed her humiliation, but she lifted her chin slightly, trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. The other passengers weren't even pretending not to watch now. Some had their arms crossed, some smirked, and a few exchanged whispered comments. One elderly woman near the front shook her head in disapproval. A younger man sitting by the window tapped his phone, clearly recording everything. The woman turned, clearly prepared to stomp her way toward the empty seat near the bathroom, the one she had avoided with so much entitlement earlier. But just as she took a step, the flight attendant placed a firm hand in front of her. "Actually, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice professional, yet laced with an unmistakable finality, "the pilot has requested to speak with you before we take off." The woman's entire body stiffened. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "The pilot?" she asked, her voice strained, as though the words had been hard to form. "Why would the pilot need to speak with me?" The flight attendant didn't budge. "He just has a few things to discuss with you regarding airline policy." The woman's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but something in the attendant's unwavering expression made her hesitate. She glanced around the cabin, searching for someone to back her up. But the man who had initially sided with her had suddenly lost interest, flipping through a magazine as if he hadn't been involved at all. The rest of the passengers just waited, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to quiet amusement. Realizing she had no other option, the woman let out a harsh exhale and nodded stiffly. "Fine," she muttered, gripping her purse even tighter. With every step she took toward the front of the plane, the whispers behind her grew louder. "She deserves this," someone muttered. "She thought she could get away with it," another whispered. A businessman sitting across from Shaq leaned slightly toward him, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "I think you just won." Shaq chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. I didn't even do anything. The businessman smirked. Exactly. A moment later, the cockpit door swung open, and the pilot stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his authority with ease. His uniform was crisp, his cap tilted slightly forward, casting a shadow over his sharp eyes. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Is there a problem here? The entire cabin fell into silence. The woman, now standing just a few feet away from him, opened her mouth, perhaps to justify her behavior, to spin the story into something else. But the words didn't come. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she was truly speechless. Shaq remained seated, arms folded, watching the moment unfold. He had no idea what the pilot was about to do, but judging by the way the woman's face paled, she was beginning to realize that she was no longer in control of how this would end. The pilot turned to the flight attendant. We don't tolerate discrimination on this airline. Then, he looked back at the woman. You have two choices. The entire plane held its breath. The woman stood frozen near the front of the cabin, her hands clenched around the strap of her designer handbag, her expression a mixture of disbelief and barely contained outrage. The pilot's gaze was steady, unwavering. His uniform was crisp, his presence commanding, and the weight of his authority settled over the first-class section like a storm cloud. We don't tolerate discrimination on this airline, he repeated, his voice calm but firm. The woman's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time since she started this spectacle, she was struggling to respond. Shaq, still seated, watched the moment unfold with quiet curiosity. He wasn't the one in control of how this played out now. The entire situation had shifted away from being just a personal insult against him. Now it was about principle. The woman wasn't just dealing with a single passenger she had looked down upon. She was now standing in front of an entire cabin of people waiting to see if she would finally face the consequences of her behavior. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she huffed, tilting her chin up. This is ridiculous, she snapped, shaking her head. I paid for first class. I have every right to feel comfortable in my seat. The pilot didn't even blink. You do, he said, but comfort isn't an excuse for discrimination. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A man in the back chuckled under his breath. She's really about to get kicked off, huh? A woman sitting across the aisle sighed. She did this to herself. The entitled woman's gaze flickered to her friend, the man who had supported her earlier, the one who had smugly backed her up when she first insisted Shaq didn't belong in first class. But now he looked down at his lap, avoiding eye contact. His support had evaporated. She was alone. Realizing this, her jaw tightened. You can't be serious, she said, looking at the flight attendant, then the pilot. This is how you treat paying customers? The pilot exhaled slowly, crossing his arms. You have two choices, he said, his voice as steady as ever. Either take your seat and treat all passengers with respect, or you can leave this flight. But one way or another, we will be departing soon. The woman's nostrils flared. Her grip on her handbag tightened. She scanned the cabin again, hoping, desperately, for someone to come to her defense. But all she found were cold, disapproving stares. No allies, no sympathy. Shaq said nothing. He didn't have to. The woman had written her own downfall, and now she was realizing there was no way to flip the script. The whispers turned into something else. A few quiet claps. Then more. A slow, deliberate ripple of applause spread through the cabin. The woman's face turned beet red. She inhaled sharply, as if preparing to lash out. But then she saw the phones. Dozens of them raised discreetly, recording every second of her humiliation. That was the final straw. With a furious grunt, she ripped her carry-on bag from the overhead compartment and yanked it down so hard the wheels smacked against the armrest of a nearby seat. She shot one last glare toward Shaq, her lips curling as if she wanted to say something. One last insult. One last attempt at holding on to whatever power she thought she had. But nothing came. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and stomped toward the exit. The flight attendant stepped aside, the pilot watching in silence as she stormed toward the jet bridge. And just like that, she was gone. The door shut behind her, sealing her fate. For a second, the cabin remained quiet. Then, laughter. A collective exhale of relief. People shook their heads, whispered to their seatmates, and finally started settling in, as if a storm had just passed. The businessman next to Shaq leaned back in his seat and grinned. "Well," he muttered, "that was satisfying." Shaq finally cracked a smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The situation had resolved itself in the best way possible. Not through shouting, not through conflict, but through the weight of accountability. A few rows down, an older woman caught Shaq's eye and nodded. "You handled that well," she said. Shaq chuckled. "I didn't really do anything." The flight attendant smiled as she walked past him, her voice light. "Exactly." The flight attendant turned to the intercom. "Now that that's settled, let's get ready for takeoff." But just as the plane began taxiing, Shaq's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I saw what happened. Call me when you land." The moment the cabin door shut behind the woman, the entire atmosphere inside the plane shifted. A weight had been lifted. Conversations resumed. Quiet laughter rippled through the first-class section, and a sense of relief settled over the passengers. The entitled woman had stormed off, humiliated, and for the first time since the flight had begun, things felt normal again. Shaq leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He wasn't the type to seek revenge or dwell on negativity, but watching the situation resolve itself so perfectly, that was satisfying. Just as he adjusted himself, a man a few rows ahead unbuckled his seatbelt and quickly walked toward Shaq. He was tall, mid-40s, dressed in a sleek navy suit, with an expensive-looking watch peeking out from under his sleeve. He stopped next to Shaq's seat, flashing a friendly grin. "I saw the whole thing," the man said, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." Shaq shrugged. "Yeah, some people just don't know when to quit." The man chuckled, then gestured to the seat he had just vacated. "Look, I know you're comfortable, but I've got the best seat on the plane. Extra legroom, better window view. Consider it my way of making up for that nonsense." Shaq raised an eyebrow, amused. "Appreciate it, man, but I'm good where I am." The man grinned. "I figured you'd say that." He patted Shaq's shoulder before heading back to his seat. As Shaq settled in again, the flight attendant from earlier walked up, holding a tray with a glass of freshly poured orange juice. She set it down gently on his tray table and smiled. "Compliments of the crew," she said warmly. "And thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for handling that with such grace. Not everyone would have kept their cool." Shaq chuckled, picking up the glass. "I just wanted to get to my destination without drama. Guess that didn't work out." She laughed. "Well, at least now we can take off in peace." She gave him a small nod before walking back toward the front of the plane. Just as Shaq was about to take a sip, the businessman seated next to him, an older man with silver hair and a sharp, confident demeanor, let out a low whistle. "Shaq," the man muttered, holding up his phone. "You might want to see this." Shaq turned his head, his curiosity piqued. The businessman angled his phone so Shaq could see the screen. A video was playing, footage from inside the cabin, capturing the entire altercation with the entitled woman. The quality was crisp, the audio clear. It had been recorded by someone a few rows behind them. Shaq's eyebrows raised slightly. He hadn't even noticed anyone filming. The video had already been posted online, and the view count was rising fast. The caption read, "Racist woman tries to remove Shaquille O'Neal from first class. Instantly regrets it." Below the video, the comments were already flooding in. Did she really think she could get away with that? Shaq handled this like a king. Best part? The flight attendant shutting her down. "I need to know what happens next. Did she get banned from flying?" Shaq let out a deep, amused sigh and leaned back in his seat. He knew how the internet worked. This wasn't just a one-time viral post. By the time they landed, this video would be everywhere. The businessman smirked. Social media is going to have a field day with this one. Just as Shaq turned his phone on to check the trending topics, it buzzed with a call. Maya, his journalist friend. He answered, and her voice came through, urgent. "Shaq, I found out who she is, and you're not going to believe it." Shaq barely had time to take a deep breath before his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. Notifications were flooding in. Mentions, tags, texts from people he hadn't heard from in years. Something was happening. He tapped open Twitter. The first thing he saw was a video, the same one the businessman had shown him earlier. But now, it had hundreds of thousands of views. The caption, "Racist woman tries to remove Shaquille O'Neal from first class. Instantly regrets it." Below it, the numbers kept climbing. 500K views, 750,000, over 1 million. The retweets were relentless. The comments a hurricane of outrage and amusement. "I hope she's banned from flying forever. Shaq handled this like a king. Respect first-class racism? Not in 2024, ma'am." Best part? The flight attendant shutting her down. News outlets were already picking up the story. CNN, ESPN, TMZ, they were all running with it. NBA legend faces shocking racism on flight. His response is priceless. Entitled, "Woman Tries to Remove Shaq from First Class. Instantly Regrets It." Viral video sparks. Debate on racism in luxury spaces. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. He had been in the public eye for decades. He knew how the internet worked. This wasn't just another viral moment. By the time the flight landed, this would be everywhere. The airline had already released a statement. He skimmed through it. "We do not tolerate discrimination on our flights. The behavior displayed in this incident does not reflect our company values. The passenger in question has been flagged for review." Translation? She was in trouble. Shaq had to laugh. He hadn't planned on this blowing up, but now the world was watching. That's when his phone rang. Maya. Maya Carter wasn't just any journalist. She was one of the best investigative reporters in the business. If anyone could dig up the truth about the woman on that flight, it was her. Shaq answered. "Maya, what's up?" Her voice was urgent. "Shaq, I found out who she is, and you're not gonna believe it." Shaq sat up straighter. "Go on." Maya's voice was sharp, urgent. "Shaq, she's not just some random racist. She's someone important." Shaq adjusted his grip on his phone, his instincts immediately on high alert. "Go on?" Maya exhaled, clearly sifting through her notes. "Her name is Victoria Hensley. She's not just an entitled first-class passenger. She's the wife of Bradley Hensley, the CEO of Hensley Financial Group." Shaq frowned. He knew that name. Hensley Financial was one of the biggest investment firms in the country. Big clients, big money, and even bigger influence. If Victoria was married into that kind of power, she wasn't just some privileged snob. She was connected. But Maya wasn't done. "And get this," she continued. "She's a board member for a major charity, one that claims to support diversity and inclusion." Shaq's eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding." "Nope," Maya said grimly. "She sits on the board of the Hensley Foundation, a nonprofit that funds educational programs for underprivileged communities. They have all this branding about uplifting marginalized voices and creating equal opportunities for all." She scoffed. "And here she is trying to kick a black man out of first class because she didn't like sitting next to him." Shaq leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. The irony was almost too much to believe. The same woman who humiliated herself on that flight was publicly pretending to care about equality. Meanwhile, the internet wasn't slowing down. As Maya spoke, Shaq refreshed his social media feed. It was exploding. Fire Victoria Hensley was trending. People were digging into her past, searching for any other racist behavior. The charity's social media pages were getting bombarded with comments. "How does this woman sit on a board promoting diversity? If she isn't removed, I'm pulling my donations. We need answers." Now, it didn't take long for the backlash to reach the Hensley Foundation. Within an hour, they released a vague statement. "We have been made aware of an incident involving one of our board members. We take matters of discrimination very seriously and are currently investigating the situation." Shaq sighed. It was the classic corporate damage control move. Say as little as possible, wait for the news cycle to move on, and hope people forget. But this time, people weren't forgetting. Maya clicked her tongue. "They're stalling." "Obviously," Shaq muttered. He'd seen this play before. Victoria would lay low, release a half-hearted apology, and keep her seat at the table. Not this time. The pressure was building. People weren't letting this go, and neither was Maya. She typed rapidly on her keyboard. "I have contacts in media. If they think they can sweep this under the rug, they're dead wrong." Shaq smirked. "You got a plan?" "Oh yeah," Maya said. "And I'm about to make some calls." Shaq leaned back, watching the chaos unfold. "They're not going to do anything," he muttered. Maya's response was instant. "Then we make sure they have no choice." The headline flashed across Shaq's phone screen. Victoria Hensley issues public apology following flight incident. He clicked the link, already knowing exactly what it would say. I deeply regret the misunderstanding that took place on my recent flight. The situation was misinterpreted, and I never intended to offend anyone. I was under immense stress that day, and my actions do not reflect who I truly am. I have always been a strong advocate for equality and inclusion. I sincerely apologize to anyone who was hurt by this incident. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Classic. Blame stress. Call it a misunderstanding. Pretend to be an advocate. Nowhere did she actually take responsibility. He scrolled down, curious about the public reaction. And sure enough, people weren't buying it. A few headlines already tore her apart. Victoria Hensley's apology fails to convince public. Rich socialite tries to save her image. Fails miserably. Fake apology. The internet thinks so. His phone buzzed. Maya. Did you see this? She asked, not bothering with a greeting. Oh yeah. Shaq's voice was dry. She really went with the, I'm sorry if you were offended angle. Yep. And the internet is shredding her. Shaq clicked open the comments. It was worse than he expected. Stress doesn't make you racist. We all saw the video. Try again. Say, I'm racist without saying I'm racist. What part of snatching a man's ticket was misinterpreted exactly? And then, the biggest bombshell. The Hensley Foundation, Victoria's own charity, released a public statement distancing themselves from her. The Hensley Foundation does not condone discrimination of any kind. We are committed to fostering an inclusive and diverse environment. Effective immediately, Victoria Hensley will no longer serve on our board. Shaq let out a low whistle. Damn, Maya muttered, reading the statement. Even her own people turned on her. She tried to save herself. Shaq leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Instead, she just made it worse. For years, Victoria Hensley had curated a perfect public image. The elite socialite, the philanthropist, the generous woman who attended charity galas and sat on diversity panels. But the moment the world saw her real face, it all crumbled. Now, every sponsorship, brand deal, and high society connection she had worked for was gone. Maya sent another link. Check this out. It was a news clip. Victoria walking briskly into her penthouse building, surrounded by reporters. Mrs. Hensley, do you stand by your apology? Are you stepping down from any other boards? Do you think you can recover from this scandal? Victoria ignored them, her sunglasses covering her expression. But Shaq could tell she was shaken. He turned the volume up as she reached the door. One last question rang out, one she clearly didn't expect. Mrs. Hensley, do you believe you were treated unfairly because you're a woman? Shaq's stomach twisted. Victoria paused, just for a second. But that was all it took. Then she stepped inside. No answer. Shaq sighed. She's about to flip the narrative, isn't she? Maya groaned. She's definitely thinking about it. If Victoria Hensley couldn't play the victim, she'd find another angle to manipulate. I bet you, Maya said. She'll wait a few weeks, then reappear on some daytime talk show, talking about how she was bullied online and misunderstood. Shaq could already picture it. A staged interview. A few well-placed tears. A carefully crafted PR campaign to make her look like the real victim. Maya sighed. But it won't work. Not this time. And Shaq knew she was right. People had watched the video. They had heard her words. They had seen her actions. No amount of damage control could erase that. She wasn't just facing public backlash. She was facing real consequences. Her charity seat, gone. Her endorsements dropped. Her reputation, destroyed. And this time, there was no coming back. Shaq smirked, putting his phone down. People don't fall for fake apologies anymore. Shaq set his phone down on the table, letting out a small chuckle. The internet was still on fire, the comment sections overflowing with discussions, reactions, and memes about the flight incident. But at this point, he wasn't surprised. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than one woman, bigger than one flight. The video had triggered a global conversation, one that went beyond just Victoria Hensley's meltdown at 30,000 feet. People were sharing their own experiences. This happened to me once in first class. A flight attendant actually asked me to show my ticket twice. Had a hotel concierge assume I wasn't a guest just because of my skin color. It's not just planes, it's restaurants, stores, boardrooms. They act like we don't belong. Shaq scrolled through, reading every comment, every story, and for the first time he realized this wasn't just about what happened on that flight. This was about who gets to feel comfortable in certain spaces, who gets to walk into a luxury lounge, a five-star hotel, a designer store, and be treated like they belong, without question. Victoria Hensley wasn't just a racist woman who humiliated herself. She was a reflection of a mindset that had been around for far too long. A ding from his phone pulled him from his thoughts. A news alert. Shaq clicked on it, eyebrows raising. Major airline announces new anti-discrimination policy after viral flight incident. His eyes skimmed the article. The airline had issued a public statement, reinforcing its zero-tolerance stance on discrimination. Effective immediately, they were implementing new training for flight attendants and rewriting passenger conduct rules to prevent incidents like this from happening again. Shaq smirked. Well, that's one way to fix the problem. Maya called a second later. Did you see the news? Oh yeah, Shaq said, still reading. They're actually doing something about it. She exhaled in disbelief. I mean, it's a PR move for sure. But still, when was the last time a major airline made policy changes this fast? She had a point. It was rare for a company to react this quickly, unless they were actually feeling the heat. The fact that they had responded at all meant one thing. This wasn't just trending. It was pressure. By the way, Maya added, guess who just deleted all her social media? Shaq laughed. He didn't even have to guess. Victoria Hensley had officially vanished. Her charity board seat, gone. Her elite social circle, disowned her. Her social media presence, wiped clean. All that was left of her was a meme, a viral clip of a woman standing in the aisle of a plane, yelling about people like us, a lesson in what happens when your true self gets caught on camera. But for Shaq, this wasn't about Victoria's downfall. This was about what came next. He tapped his phone screen, opening his own social media. Time to say something. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he typed, "Respect isn't a privilege. It's a right. Simple. Director. No dragging Victoria. No name-calling. Just a statement of truth." Within seconds, the post started racking up likes, comments, and reposts. But the best part? People weren't just reacting. They were talking. This isn't just a one-time thing. It happens every day, everywhere. If you think racism is over, just read the comments under this post. We need more public figures calling this stuff out. The conversation was happening, and it wasn't stopping anytime soon. Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching as the numbers climbed. Maybe one viral moment wouldn't change the world, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. Do you think the airline handled it the right way? Comment below and let us know.